Welcome, everyone. I see people coming into the webinar. We're going to give it a few minutes just to make sure everyone's logged on before we get started. See a few more people trickling on. Welcome. We're going to wait a few more minutes just to make sure we've got everyone before we get started. Welcome. I see a few more people have just logged on. We're probably going to give it till about 6:05 before we get started, just so we're sure that everyone gets to see it from the beginning. Anyone after 6:05 though, forget about it. All right, so it's 6:05 now. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone who's joined us so far. My name is Dr. Amy Catherine Medvick, and I am the Director of Educational Programming here at Hermann-Grima Gallier Historic Houses. For those who are new, Hermann-Grima Gallier Historic Houses, managed by the Women's Exchange, preserves two 19th century New Orleans homes, and through their architecture, collections, and history, inspires discourse about our collective past and its relevance to our present and future. We invite you to come visit us next time you're in the French Quarter. This event is made possible by funding from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. Funding for 2021 Rebirth Grants has been administered by the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities and provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the American Rescue Plan and the NEH Sustaining the Humanities through the American Rescue Plan Initiative. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So, it is my great honor to introduce our two speakers this evening. Nix Mendy is a library associate at Tulane University, where they are responsible for processing archival collections and contributing to the Inclusive-Reparative Working Group around the representation of marginalized communities in archives. They also serve as the digital archives consultant for OUTWORDS, an oral history archive centered on LGBTQIA2S+ elders. They received their MLIS in Archives Management from Simmons University and BFA in Writing, Literature, and Publishing from Emerson College. As a poet and archivist, their interests include oral histories and traditions, horror, fantasy, and folklore, especially related to African and LGBTQ+ communities. Mara LePere-Schloop, with a master's degree in architecture from Tulane University, has worked as an architect, furniture designer, and builder, and has volunteered as a project manager for the international nonprofit Learn to Live, building rainwater catchment and filtration systems in Northwest Sulawesi, Indonesia. LePere-Schloop's work as an art director garnered her an Art Directors Guild nomination for Outstanding Art Direction for her work on Django Unchained, and a win for her work on True Detective, for which she was also nominated for an Emmy. As a production designer, Mara has worked with directors such as Cary Fukunaga, M. Night Shyamalan, Anna Boden, and Ryan Fleck, Phil Abraham, as well as many others. Mara was nominated for an Emmy for her design work in The Alienist and won an Art Directors Guild Award for the show. Her work in film and television has taken her all around the world, where she continues to pursue an education of the built world. Last year, she completed work on the acclaimed Apple TV Plus series Pachinko. Tonight's virtual panel will focus on archival practice and historical accuracy in creative work. Nix Mendy will present on Anne Rice's research process when writing historical and supernatural fiction, including how Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses inspired her world building in Interview with the Vampire and the Feast of All Saints. Mara LePere-Schloop, production designer for the new Interview with the Vampire TV series, will demonstrate how AMC's production team balanced historical and fictional accuracy with their desire to update the novel for a modern audience. Please give a warm welcome to Nix Mendy and Mara LePere-Schloop. And so I do believe we're going to start with Nix's presentation. So take it away, Nix.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us to talk about Anne Rice archives and the specific impacts that archives have on the history of New Orleans and generally the history of creative work. To begin, I would like to generally just give everyone an overview of what an archive is, what archival processing is, and some of the challenges in processing the collection before switching over into talking about Anne's research process and her specific ways of engaging her own creative work. So an archive is a place where people can go to gather firsthand facts, data, and evidence from manuscripts, letters, reports, notes, photographs, and other sort of primary sources. Archival collections are generally gathered from one person, one group, one organization, or one kind of like overarching institution in terms of our government. But they also may represent a family, which is the case for the Anne Rice collection, in that it encompasses both Anne's creative process, Stan Rice's creative process, and also Alice Borchart's creative process, and the ways in which all of their creative work sort of overlaps and intersects. So when we talk about archival processing, we're really talking about what it means to preserve and house these documents, and also these may be, digital files or audio recordings or, many different ways of recording information, but inevitably we're looking to gain a sense of how the collection comes to us in terms of condition and what is needed for the preservation of the collection. And then we also are then going through and trying to get a sense of how the creator or the sort of governing body of the collection documents itself, and provides evidence of historical events, of creative processes for the case of Anne Rice, and just other aspects of the history of the creator and of the organization. So with Anne's collection, we acquired the collection through the generous donation of Stuart Rose and the Stuart Rose Family Foundation, which gave us the opportunity to house Anne's materials in, like her city of origin, which is really amazing in that researchers are now going to be able to specifically relate the built environment of New Orleans to Anne's work and be able to make those connections. Whereas if this had been housed in California, for example, some of the resonances of New Orleans may not have been as present. So the Anne Rice collection itself is a combination of 3 specific authors, Anne Rice, Stan Rice, and her sister Alice Borchardt, and documents their professional development as writers and also their personal lives that sort of coincide with their writing. Rice's collection is one of the largest manuscript collections at Tulane libraries, and it illustrates her immersion in and engagement with the culture of New Orleans from a young age and all the way through her adulthood. So the collection is essentially about 90% manuscript material. And if you put the acquisition itself back to back, it would encompass half a football field. So we're looking at a lot of paper material, but we are also getting into like a lot of manuscript material in terms of like the drafts of her novels and her research materials and everything that she sort of needs to build the worlds that she is creating. But we are also getting into the impact of Anne on her fans and just generally like the world of publishing. So we are able to see correspondence from her publishers talking about how her work is promoted and marketed. We're able to get firsthand letters from her fans about the impact that she has made on their lives. We're also able to, see how people are subscribing to her newsletter, her fan club, and just generally engaging with the world that she's creating. In terms of her personal materials, we're getting into her diaries. She was a prolific diarist, and in the collection, we have like 210 of her handwritten diaries, which specifically not only document sort of her day-to-day life as a college student through becoming an internationally best-selling novelist, but also getting into all of the projects that she is working on and just generally her thought process in getting into these novels. And so we're really able to see all of the projects that Anne has sort of like put forth, but also all the projects that she just never went forward with. And Also in the collection, we have many of her early works and concepts, which are unseen and unproduced and unpublished. So we really get to see the ways in which Anne is working on essentially 5 different projects at any given time. And she is constantly reassessing what it means to, like create a specific project. In that a lot of her projects are sort of related to the same themes and are also specifically working towards some of the same goals and intentions. And so while many of her projects did not come to fruition, you see the same sort of like thematic arc of her career in looking at both her published works and the works that did not get published. We also have a lot of personal records from her elementary school through collegiate years, her personal correspondence with her family and friends, which sort of helps undergird her career in that she's also just managing many relationships with people and is constantly showing how her career affects her personal life. And then we are also have collected her business records, which essentially talk about her tours in the Garden District of New Orleans, her ability to like merchandise and through dolls, through comic books, through many different aspects that go beyond the world of her novels to really influence her work. And then in regard to her husband's and her sister's materials, we have similarly their manuscripts, their audio recordings, and things that would specifically relate to their creative processes and how Anne also affects their creative processes. So the challenges of processing a collection that is this large is just the sheer volume of material in many different formats by different creators. So as I said before, if you put Rice's archival material back to back, it would span half a football field. And this means that while there is a large amount of manuscript material, there are unique formats like digital files, drawings and collages, audio recordings on cassettes, her diaries, and just many different aspects that require a different set of preservation interventions. Similarly related to that is the unique position of Tulane Special Collections as a department. We have only recently come together as one archival division. So we have unique collecting units like the Louisiana Research Collection, the Hogan Archive of New Orleans Music and New Orleans Jazz, Rare Books, the Southeastern Architectural Archive, and University Archives. And when we merge together as one whole division, we are looking to create overarching goals, management tools, and preservation standards, whereas before, each unit sort of managed itself. And one of the largest things that came out of this was the creation of a newly formed collection management team to sort of facilitate this new focus on preservation, quality control, and just generally like best practices for our collections across the board. So in this context, the Rice collection became an opportunity to really drill down on what procedures we wanted to implement across the board and really think holistically about to think holistically about, what is needed to preserve our collections into the future. And then lastly, we also had a lot of pandemic and hurricane related delays. So obviously the shutdown of 2020 to slow the spread of the coronavirus, and Hurricane Ida would separate me physically from the collection. So I could not work on it. But also we had like COVID exposures and isolation periods. We had to really identify the need for new supplies, along with delays in shipments because of just not having materials on hand. And just like the challenges of working in a hybrid work environment where it wasn't guaranteed that my colleagues would be on site to review the materials or offer feedback. And so we started also reshaping our sense of communication with each other and adding in more documentation to ensure that we were all sort of on the same page about what is happening with the collection and where we're going with the collection, and also how this collection would influence the labeling of future collections, and other preservation interventions in future collections. So this was an opportunity for us to really prepare for future processing projects and iron out the ways in which Rice was both a unique collection in its size and scope, and also kind of similar to all the collections that we have on campus. So when it comes to Rice's research process about New Orleans, she approaches it from many different angles. One angle is that she is combing through the University of California, Berkeley's library, and she's checking out multiple books, academic articles, related novels, and theses. And not only is she reading all of these things and sort of taking it in, but she's also documenting the resources that she's using and organizing them by topic. So when she's studying New Orleans, she is looking into like the physical landscape, plantation layouts, clothes and furnishings, free people of color, yellow fever, for example. So she's seeking to gain an overall sense of the social relations, race relations, and the development of New Orleans and Cane River as compared to free people of color communities in other American port cities such as Charleston. And she sort of snakes her way throughout the entire 18th century to settle more squarely on the early 18th century through the 1860s. So after having gone through all of these resources, she is writing what she calls beer raps. These are handwritten and typescript notes to herself about characterization, plot, and the challenges of integrating her research with her own intentions for her works. And so it's really amazing to see her go through either sitting at her house or in different bars in the city and different bars in California, such as, a bar directly outside of the Squaw Valley writing community. She's really consistently talking to herself about her novels and sort of squaring away the information that she needs to write her novels, and really trying to gain a sense of, her overall flow. And the sort of third tactic that she uses for research is just immersion. So when she is researching New Orleans, she is going through the French Quarter, she's going through the Irish Channel, and she's really trying to square the historic architecture the climate and the physical layout, and also different aspects of the city with what she has read. And she also uses her interview with the vampire advance to take a trip to Port-au-Prince, Haiti in 1977, and really also does the same squaring of the overall layout of Haiti with her conceptualization of Haiti that she's gotten from her books. And so in all three of these ways, Rice is really essentially reconceptualizing what it means to do research. And she's not solely relying on historians or primary resources. She is also following her own specific sense of what makes sense for her characters, what makes sense for just the ways in which she is conceptualizing her characters. And while her historical research definitely influences the sort of background of her characters, she really sort of stays true to the original characterization of most of her characters, only really enhancing them by, supplementing it with historical research and a historical background. And I also wanted to share a quote that I think speaks to what Anne is seeking to do in her novels overall. So she, in being deeply inspired by Russian and English novelists, is talking about how she wants to hit the essential dream, where you need no furniture, the edges disintegrate, the characters are as real and exaggerated as those of a dream. Only this dream is compact, truly meaningful, and utterly essential. And so essentially what Anne is doing in her research process is cutting out anything that she does not see as utterly essential to her process. And while the historical research is a undergirding of everything that Anne seeks to do in ensuring that New Orleans is properly represented and that New Orleans as a place comes through holistically and truly, she also knows that she needs to follow her own drum and follow her own sense of self. And to get to the essential dream, you also have to not only be able to integrate your research into your work, but you also have to essentially have a dream. You have to have a dream of what your work means and what it could mean to audiences, what it could mean to different people. And Anne essentially is studying history and studying craft to specifically break it, to specifically break the boundaries of what any of this means. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nix. So we are going to hold off the Q&A until the very end of the presentation. And so I am now pleased to pass the mic over to Mara.
Hi, everybody. If you give me just a second, I'm going to be showing you guys some stuff. So I'm going to open a presentation. So as Amy said, my name is Mara LePere-Schloop, and I am a production designer, and I worked on the new AMC series, which is a reimagining of Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire. And we, I'm going to get into, what's so fascinating about what Nix was talking about with Anne is her process and her kind of solo path on this vigorous research journey that built a foundation to tell these elaborate, dense stories. And contrary to her kind of solo path in filmmaking, it's a collaborative medium. And for all of us, we kind of have the opposite path as Anne. We have to unravel these scripts and stories and figure out, do our own analysis and research and figure everything out. And that becomes our building blocks for pursuing our own specific role in that process. But I'm going to get into all that. But first, I kind of wanted to talk. I didn't realize it until I worked on this project, but I think Anne Rice is the reason I am here today and do what I do. And I didn't put two and two together until I worked on this project. But when I was a small child, that's me on the right, I was really into horror, suspense, and thrillers, which I'm not sure if my parents were thrilled with that, but I think they were glad I was reading. And when I first read Interview with a Vampire, I was just blown away by the immersive, incredible, visceral descriptions of New Orleans. And I thought it was just this magical place. And when I was 10 or 11, I came here with my family on my father had a conference here, and we took a ghost tour, and I couldn't believe that this place that I thought was imaginary was actually real, and it seemed just as magical in person as it had in Anne's novels. And I think that to me is her true gift to all of us, is just her ability to describe these elaborate worlds that create a sense of place that's so memorable and distinct. And it's why people are so desperate to make them film and television. The attempts to get the rights to this series has been kind of notoriously bandied about Hollywood. And so for AMC to have the rights to all of the Anne Rice canon is pretty incredible. And it was amazing to be a part of that, to kick it off with Interview with a Vampire. I think that the other part of Anne Rice that was mesmerizing to me was her legacy as this kind of preservation superhero in New Orleans. And I came down here to get my master's degree in architecture from Tulane, and I heard these stories of these full-page editorial ads that Anne took out to fight Al Copeland was trying to open a restaurant, kind of gaudy postmodern restaurant in a building on St. Charles. And if you ever get a chance, Google this and read this full letter that she wrote. It's actually directed to tourists coming to New Orleans and apologizing to them by the poor taste of Al Copeland. And I just thought, what an amazing person that makes this her personal battle and does it with just such flourish. And unfortunately, she lost this battle, and that Cheesecake Factory was made, or whatever it ended up being. But part of this kind of continuing lore and magnetism and how Anne has affected my life, my husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, was a member of Green Envy, which was an a cappella group in New Orleans. And he was invited with the a cappella group to sing at one of her Christmas parties at the orphanage that she had converted into a home. And I begged, stole, pleaded to get in, because all I wanted to do was see her house. And I got to sneak in with the a cappella group, and there was a cookie table, which blew my mind, but also all the dolls. But again, this kind of, I think that I can also probably credit Anne for my marriage now, because it boosted him in my esteem that he got me into this party. And continuing the legacy of me crashing parties, the other side of the coin, the Al Copeland side, I was just as drawn to him as a character in New Orleans. And when I was in college, I worked at CC's, and every year they would allow 2 baristas from the CC's in New Orleans to come and serve coffee at Al Copeland's famous Christmas parties. And I did everything in my power to be one of those baristas. And I got to go in and see what many claimed was the, out in Metairie, the Christmas display that could be seen from outer space. And, this is the other side of the Anne Rice coin, the opposite of preservation in our city, but just as compelling that New Orleans can produce these incredible characters. So I'm going to get into what I'm really here for now, which is talking about filmmaking and Anne Rice and New Orleans and architecture. And I just wanted to give you guys a quick kind of understanding of the breakdown of filmmaking, because when I say I'm a production designer, a lot of people don't really understand what that means. So I'm basically the architect of a film or television project. And I'm one of the first people hired, and I work directly with the producers and the directors to create the look of the show. And television, unlike in film, the writer or showrunner is kind of king, because they have to keep an eye on the entire, all the episodes, not just the one film. And so television is a little bit different than film. And on this particular project, our showrunner, our writer, was a gentleman named Rollin Jones. And very similar to Anne Rice, Rollin immersed himself in a rigorous history of New Orleans. And I think what's incredible about what Nix was saying before about Anne, you know, we think about vampires and kind of the iconicism of vampire television and film, and she created this entire genre and world. And so much of that research that went into defining a sense of time and place in the early 1800s has become kind of a defining feature of vampire representation in film and television. And I think Rollin took a look at that and did another kind of thorough examination of New Orleans and history. And a very underrepresented period of New Orleans in film and television is the era of Storyville. And I think for Rollin, diving into that history and kind of landing on a time and place that was just as dynamic and allowed for some other interpretations of the story gave us a really great launching point to move on to make the series. So I'm going to get into more of Storyville later, but going back to kind of what we do. So as the production designer or the architect of the show, my department is comprised of construction and scenics, the painters, the welders, and we have an art director who's kind of the project manager that oversees all of them. The decorator is the person who handles all of the interior design, and props are anything the actors touch. So on average, on a show like this, we have sometimes 300 people working for us. And that's just in the art department. We usually are the biggest department, but there's hair, makeup, wardrobe, and all sorts of things. And we all have to work together to make the words on the page come to life. On any project, we start with a script. And so for Interview with the Vampire, when I first was introduced to the project, I was given the first episode. And as a fan of Anne Rice and the original novel, I think my initial reaction was a little bit of panic and fear when I read that it was a different time period. And then what I realized was we were being introduced to this kind of new, wonderful era that we haven't really gotten to experience before, as I said, on screen. And then I got more and more excited about the potential, because here we had the heart of these characters that she had so beautifully written, introduced into a new landscape. Anytime we start projects as designers, the first thing we do is kind of an intensive breakdown of those scripts to come up with a list of all the different sets and scenes, so that we have an understanding of what the scope of the show is. We don't always have all the scripts. In this case, we did not, but you have general outlines or general sense of what's coming and what's going. And one fundamental of telling stories of vampires is the evolution of time. And so we knew from the get-go that this was going to be something that we weren't going to be stayed in one time period, but this was going to be kind of, we would be tracking them as time evolved. So in our first season of Interview with the Vampire, we are in the time periods of 1910 to about 1940, and with a little bit of contemporary storytelling as well for the interview. So we do these initial breakdowns to understand what's going on. And then usually this is something I do independently when I start. It's just me, the director, producers on. And then I dive headfirst into an aggressive research period. And whenever Nix talks about Anne's research, it really reminds me, I feel like I walked a similar path to what Anne was kind of experiencing doing. I think that where you want to surround yourself with as many different resources as possible, And so what's amazing about New Orleans and the preservation societies and the history here is that so much is extremely well documented and preserved. And so there's incredible resources like the pattern books and the historic drawing plans that not only kind of give you a foundation of what drawing types and what architecture types were at the time, but it's also like a really great resource of what period architecture still exists in New Orleans today. And so I turned to these initially to kind of come up with a laundry list of places that our locations team could reach out to explore. The Blue Book, because our story takes place in Storyville, was an incredible asset as well, in that there's not a lot of photographic reference of Storyville anymore. And so a lot of it we're having to rely upon are oral narratives or descriptions. And the Blue Book was the guidebook to Sin. So it was actually like a tour guide. It had addresses and names of all the brothels that existed in Storyville. And for those of you that aren't familiar with what Storyville is, it was a 40-block diameter section of New Orleans where prostitution was sanctioned for a very brief period of time in New Orleans. And so it was kind of this like wild and crazy, not necessarily lawless, but it definitely pushed the boundaries of what law is in this small zone. And I think many attribute this time period and this kind of mixing of cultures and place and race to some of the birth of American jazz as well. So beyond kind of the archival drawings and books and things, what's amazing about New Orleans are these kind of living archives. And the Hermann-Grima House, the Gallier House, the 1850s House, the Historic New Orleans Collection, all these places have some of the best tours I've ever been on of historic homes, because they give you a sense of not just what things look like, but also how people lived. And for filmmakers, this is really great fodder for just kind of like expanding world building and allowing for great development in set building and storytelling. So before we knew for sure that the show was coming to New Orleans, I kind of incognito went on all of these house tours. I think everyone knew by the number of questions I was asking eventually that something was up. But I think that from the get-go, that it's been known, Anne has said before that Lestat's house was Gallier House, which is 1132 Royal Street. And so this became a kind of big beat of, like background beat of a drum for Rollin and I for the show, which was, even though our time period was slightly more contemporary compared to the novel, how incredible would it be for the fans and for everyone to be able to shoot at the Gallier House. And so with the help of our locations team and the folks at Gallier House, that was able to become a reality. And I'll get into more about that a little bit later. So beyond the historic homes and the tours and all of that, there's the streets of New Orleans also provide just an incredible lesson of history, of the history of design in the city. Treme is one of the closest approximations to what Storyville potentially was. Storyville was knocked down in the 30s and 40s, and so doesn't exist anymore. And so walking around the neighborhoods of Treme, walking around the French Quarter, there's a ton of inspiration to be found about what potentially this world could be. What became clear pretty early on was that we weren't going to be able to shoot it in Storyville. Wasn't something we could shoot in New Orleans for New Orleans. We'd probably have to build it. But these are part of the kind of building blocks that this research and reference process starts to kind of peel away, which is, what we have to build versus what we can shoot at actual locations. Another asset that I love to use as much as we can are consultants for our various period projects. So in New Orleans, I've actually used Richard Campanella a couple of times now, once before for Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, which I think was a grand waste of his knowledge and resources, but helpful nonetheless. Richard is a geographer and a dean of research with the Tulane School of Architecture and a prolific writer, and one of the most profoundly intelligent people I've ever had the pleasure of talking to. And Richard was a really great resource for kind of broad strokes understanding of history of time and place, of understanding what the city looked like in terms of infrastructure, with roadworks, with waterworks, with electricity, like all sorts of things. But he also had great anecdotes about, people in bars and brothels and what was happening. I recommend reading his books for anyone who has any interest in New Orleans history. They're pretty fantastic. Elizabeth Simpson was another resource that we used. Elizabeth has one of the coolest job titles I've ever heard. She's a chromochronologist and an interior designer. So she actually goes in and takes paint chips off of walls and slowly peels them apart to determine like the history of paint colors, specifically in the French Quarter in New Orleans. So we worked with her to talk about finishes and color, since we were potentially going to be building a part of New Orleans that didn't exist anymore. So after all of that kind of gathering and pulling from different places, we start to kind of create these boards, these reference boards of, what this world could be if we could do anything. This is what the foundation of what it could be would be. And so this starts to become the process where I get out of my head and out of the research and into the mode of sharing with all of the various people that are going to have to actualize these things. So we create these boards for hundreds of different sets. And, again, one of the biggest things, because our story is a story of vampires and largely at night, because that's when they can go out, the evolution of time has to be told through the evolution of lighting technology. So that was a really big thing that we had to dive into, was, what in our time frame from 1910 to 1940, what were the advances in lighting technology that we wanted to showcase to kind of feel that pattern and rhythm. One of the greatest I've found resources for any sort of building are the Sanborn fire insurance maps. So this is an incredible collection of resources that were thrown at mapping out cities across America as insurance guides. But they kind of detailed street size, lot size, how many people lived in certain homes. But they're these incredible, for us, when we have to recreate a world, they give us this incredible insight into the foundation of place. So combining all of those things, we started to create our own kind of roadmap of what Storyville looked like in that time period.
Looks like we are having some connectivity issues on Mara's end. Hopefully she gets it. So while we're waiting for Mara to log back on, if anyone has a question, please submit it in the Q&A function. That helps us keep it organized and we can make sure we get everyone's questions answered. And maybe we can address a few while we're waiting. there's one question for Nix. A guest was asking if you could repeat the word that the author used to describe her notes, characters. It sounded like raps, but she's not sure.
Right, it is raps, but it's RAPS. So like rapping to herself about her ideas.
Gotcha. Great. Oh, looks like we have Mara back.
Hey guys, sorry, I am at a trailer park in Boise, Idaho. Not sure what happened, but I got kicked off the internet. So bear with me. I'm not sure where I lost you guys. Does anybody have a...
I think we were looking at the point when you were starting to like build the conceptual map of Storyville. And
Okay.
you have pictures with the arrows pointing to the map.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen again.
The audience says slide 21.
Slide 20. Okay, I'm going to jump to 22 so we don't waste any time. So another big thing that we have to do is, because we have to share all this information with so many different people, is we have to come up with formats to illustrate these things in clear and interesting ways, because there's so many people that have to be a part of this. So we would create these timelines that would showcase all of the kind of relevant movements of things that were happening that might relate to the art department. So movements in art department, what art was popular in 1910s versus the 1920s versus 30s, 40s, what political movements were happening that might inform newspaper headlines, what advances in vehicle technology, because we have to have picture cars and scenes. You know, all of these things, you have to have this cohesive understanding of it all so that you can have these subtle nods as the story progresses and time progresses without hitting your audience over the head with like a huge cryon that says, now it's 1930. You know, it's like, how can you subtly inform in the background what's happening in time? So this is kind of a fun thing that one of the first visual things that we do on any project is a show logo. This is just an internal image that's used kind of on the clapper or for crew t-shirts or things like that. But for me, this is always kind of the kickoff of the creative gestation of all these things. And I think it's also kind of, it keys you into what kind of showrunner and directors you have. And what I love about our team is that there was a lot of humor and wit in the scripts, and we wanted to have that as part of our logo. And so we did these in the vein of Edward Gorey and got a little bit of humor into these. But this is the kickoff to the creative process for a lot of shows. This will never be seen in the show. This is just kind of an internal behind the scenes thing, but it's a fun exercise. Our process really kicks off with the scouting team, because the first thing we have to do is figure out what we're going to build and what's a location. And the great thing about AMC deciding to make this show in New Orleans is there's so many incredible resources in the city to play off of. So we did a really aggressive initial pass. And the great thing about having lived here for 20 years is I didn't really have to go out and scout a lot of things. I pretty much knew what there was, but it gives you a great access to a lot of these places. So we start with me giving them reference and research, and then they pull file pulls of places they shot before. I go out and scout those places, and we start to build this roadmap of where and how all of these things are going to be conceived on screen. And I think what's amazing is there are so many well-preserved places in New Orleans, like Gallier Hall, or Gallier House, Gallier Hall, Hermann-Grima, Beauregard Keys, and Benacci House. There's a lot of really incredible places that have not suffered the consequence of time. So from there, we start to break down an overall strategy of what needs to be built because it physically doesn't exist, or we can't shoot there, and what has to be, what can be at a location. And that becomes a very aggressive matrix that we hand over to the ADs, which are the assistant directors, to start to kind of congeal into an overall schedule and strategy for plan. Meanwhile, we're sketching out and starting to design the sets that we have realized that we're going to need to build. And this, paired with the research and reference, then gets handed over to a team of set designers who start doing 3D modeling and sketching to figure things out. So we knew, because we'd be shooting months of nights in Storyville, in a place that does not exist, that we were going to need to build a backlot that represented the streets of Storyville. And so we started playing around in 3D to look at size and scale of what might need to be built for that exercise. And then from there, you get kind of, every step gets deeper and deeper into the nitty gritty. So the details of the architecture, kind of pairing that history, those references and resources that we found, and allocating them into different places within our design. And it kind of gets deeper and deeper into the minutia as we go. This entire time, we're working hand in hand with the director and the cinematographer, who are figuring out how they're going to be shooting this. And so it gives us into insight if we need to finish inside of a room on a second floor because they want a camera angle from that position, or if there's a story beat where someone has to walk into a space from the street. So there's all sorts of overlapping departments that have to figure out the mechanics of how these things are going to work. We also have to think about elements like, if a scene is scripted for rain, these have to be waterproof. It's New Orleans, it also has to be waterproof. What we didn't realize is that it had to be tornado proof, which one of our big green screens blew over in that big tornado that hit early this spring. So that was not fun, but things you learn. Getting back to the concept of kind of living spaces, these sets aren't just, they don't stand in isolation. These sets have to be immersive. They have to be inhabited by background, by actors, by all these things. So all of that research that we did, oftentimes we come up with these kind of reference boards and concept ideas that we then share with the ADs, costumes, hair, makeup, so that we say, we built this with the intention of this kind of street life happening. And there's also directors, producers, writers also inform so much of this overlap of this collaborative world of filmmaking, where none of us survive on our own. We're only as good as the matrix of people that kind of work within this. And it's always incredible when those things come to life. We wanted to imbibe as many great details of the actual Storyville that we could. And so I hope you watch the series and you can kind of catch glimpses of those little Easter eggs and nods to the history of that time and place. And there's a lot of them. These are some illustrations of the backlot that we did. And this is, again, so much of what we do within the art department is about informing others of kind of process and plan, or to make a pitch for budget, or for lighting, for example, like how we're going to do these things. And so whenever we produce this artwork, we start without any people, place, cars or anything like that. So it's just about the architecture. And because this is a story about vampires and it was all at night, we built, we were going to build this big backlot and it would only be seen at night. So much of what we had to think about, again, was the lighting process in this. And then adding the people to that world to talk about density, how many background were going to be needed, how many cars, again, the evolution of time and lighting. Just changing the paint color of a building wasn't going to do enough. It would have to involve lighting. So we had to dig pretty deep into the evolution of those time periods and what was happening with lighting to figure out how this backlot was going to feel different. We built 2 different streets. The first you just saw was Iberville, which was kind of our main drag of Storyville, and in our kind of creation or fantasy world of Storyville. Basin Street was actually the true strip of Storyville, but it's not a great, it's a huge boulevard street, and it's not a great thing to build a backlot for because you'd constantly be looking off the set. So we kind of manipulated history a little bit there and created our main drag on Iberville. And then we built a street deeper into the 40 blocks that was played as both Liberty and Franklin, which was more of the rent by the hour, divey crib street, in a kind of vernacular of architecture that doesn't exist much in this scale anymore in New Orleans. Again, looking at what lighting does for that evolution of time. So while this design gestation is happening, the ADs are producing a schedule. This is not from our show, this is from another show that, but just to give you an example of what happens, on a general shooting day. You might have 3 or 4 different sets shooting, but it's this elaborate matrix of locations, set builds, stage builds. All these things have to come together, and every department has to produce these things to make it happen. So it's really a miracle whenever we can pull off an entire shooting schedule, sometimes hundreds of days of shooting of all of these different imagined worlds. This is an example of an art department schedule, again, for another show, but it gives you an idea of where we all have to be at any given time, and it's usually about 300 different places. But it's just a massive organizational feat to make sure that everything can be delivered on time and in place to make these things happen. And the irony of it all is most of the time we do all these things, but we have no idea what's actually going to be captured on camera, because as much as we plan, as much as you might storyboard and map these things out, it doesn't always mean that it's going to go exactly the way you think. And so it's an art of letting go and patience to do all these things and then let it go into the hands of someone else to capture. So getting back to Gallier House and being able to actually shoot here and use it for the story location of the Stats Townhouse, we were going to shoot the exteriors at the location. So that meant Royal Street, which is the street that Gallier House sits on, was going to play as our entry to the house. And we would use the backyard of Gallier House as it was, but that we would end up building for kind of our own control and flexibility and shooting the interior entirely on stage. And so we spent a lot of time surveying and doing an analysis of Gallier House and kind of seeing what worked. The overall scale of it had to be comparable because we were shooting from the exterior to the interior, but then we made some tweaks to kind of fit to our own kind of shooting agenda. There were certain things that we had to make exact replicas of. For example, the balcony on the second floor, we had to see through that on stage, so we had to match that exactly. And then there were things that we just wanted to have, pay an homage to James Gallier Jr. and the incredible design of the interior of the home. And so, I think it's very easy to fall in love with the crown molding at the house, and I did 10 times over, as well as the crown moldings. And so that was something that we didn't do an exact replica, but a kind of an homage to that relief detail in the crown molding. The other kind of fascinating, great thing that Gallier introduced to the house that was very novel for the time period was a skylight on the second floor, which worked as a light for his office space. And that's something, again, this is when the magic of working on a collaborative art form. I thought this was such a great detail, and I mentioned it to Rollin, our writer, and he actually wrote it into the scripts, and it has a kind of compelling story point, which I won't spoil for y'all, but I'd say keep an eye out for it in the series. This right here on the 2 photos, one of these is our build on stage, and the other one is the actual entrance to Gallier House. I think we did a pretty good job of replicating all those details so that we could have a connective tissue between our stage set and the location. But this is the kind of detail that we have to get into, and it would have been easy to just say, let's take the gates down, they're too hard to replicate. But this is part of the magic of New Orleans, is this history of lavish detail and ornaments, and we wanted to have that as part of our story. This is an illustration of our interior design for this set. Can't show you any photos of it, but I hope you watch the show so you can kind of see where we're going. This is another huge part of our world building, is the interior furnishings. So we have to fill these places entirely. So it's built completely by scratch. So all of the wallpaper, the drapery, everything has to be manufactured and produced or purchased. So this is a huge part of our world as well. And one of the really fun parts of character and world building, where you're starting from nothing and you really get to create a universe for them to inhabit. The not so fun part of that is we also have to have it legally cleared, because this is going to be airing on television. So every single thing you see in a set has to go through a legal kind of juggernaut. So from the wallpaper to the matchbook, to the newspaper, to the wine bottle, to the deck of cards, we're either building that from scratch or finding the creator and hoping to get a release form signed by them. So our world building goes down to these kind of innocuous, crazy details that we have to chase around the world to find out whether or not we can show them. We also have our team of set designers working rigorously to produce construction documents for all of these things to be built from scratch. And so we have to go, build everything from the windows to the doors. And, every detail is something that has to be created for these sets. Our backlot actually was built out in Chalmette in New Orleans East in the parking lot of an old Lowe's. And you could see it from Judge Perez Highway. If anybody drove by, I'm sure you saw bits and pieces of it, especially after the tornado ripped down our green screen. We also had to, all the signage, all that lighting that you saw, every bit of that was designed and built from scratch and had to go through the clearance process. So we had huge teams of electricians working with us to hand wire all of these individual bulbs to kind of accurately convey the technology of the time period and what type of lighting was being used. All of the hardware, the window shutters, the doorknobs for every single facade on our backlot had to be sourced and installed by our teams. One of the incredible things about working in New Orleans is that there's a huge resource. There's a lot of resources of antiquities in the city. So whether it's Ricca's or the bank for period hardware, or H. Ralt, or Orleans Ornamental for the wrought iron, there's all these places that we can turn to help us create a layer of authenticity on our projects. And there's also amazing sign shops that work with us to fabricate and build a lot of our signs. These are some images of the finished product of our backlot. So again, this is all built from the ground up. This is the parking lot in Lowe's. So the cobblestone all was installed, the wrought iron, all the signage, all the buildings, everything you see here was custom made for this particular project. And we shot out here for a few weeks, and it is in the process. Parts of it are being torn down now in advance of hurricane season. This is Liberty Street. This was the crib street. That's kind of the lower rent section of that world. And you can see how, that similar to Anne, who, as Nix mentioned, had to create this kind of foundation of reference and research so that she was able to create these incredible worlds in which her characters inhabit. For us, we have to create that same foundation and work off of to be able to literally build these sets for the shows. And I think, that kind of shared space of history diving is something that I found really incredible talking to Nix about. I'm going to finish up here. This is a drone shot that our medic actually took of the backlot in Chalmette, and it gives you guys a final kind of glimpse at the finished product of the backlot. It's a little slow, might be a little jerky. I'm gonna maybe speed it up for you guys, but you can see this massive collaboration that has to take place to make just the set piece for shooting these types of shows. this doesn't show you any of the people or the cars or the lighting that needs to happen for the cinematographer. There's just an incredible amount of teamwork that has to happen to make these worlds come alive. And I'm gonna turn this off and hand it back over to Amy.
All right. Well, thank you so much, both of you. Two fascinating presentations. I'm super excited now too about the show. So we're going to pass it off to the Q&A. I'm going to turn my light on because my footage is getting grainy. Here we go. That didn't help. Okay. Well, anyhow, we're going to open it up to questions. So if anyone has any questions, you can throw those in the Q&A function, and that'll allow us to keep it organized. And so I'm just going to start throwing you those questions. So the first couple of questions are for Nix. So the first question is, where are the Anne Rice archives located, and what are the hours that the public could view Anne Rice's work?
The Anne Rice archives are located at Tulane University Special Collections, which is a division of Tulane Libraries. It's specifically part of the Louisiana Research Collection, which is a collection of, like, a collecting unit that specifically focuses on the history of Louisiana and New Orleans specifically. So we also have a lot of writers from the region that Anne sort of is able to play off of. In terms of hours, I believe they're 10 to 4.
Excellent. And another question for Nix, what sort of measures is the university taking to preserve the non-digital media in the Rice collection?
Sure. Well, I think transferring all of Anne's manuscripts into, like, acid-free folders and acid-free boxes, which generally helps the stability of the paper, keeping them in a climate-controlled environment also helps the stability of the collection. In terms of what I specifically did as preservation interventions, photocopying sticky notes that would fall off, extracting tape that was leaching acid, extracting staples, different rusty fasteners, paper clips, rubber bands, which essentially, like, literally just disintegrate. So there's a lot of sort of small preservation actions that we take. I think the biggest preservation action that we're taking at present is making sure that all of Anne's diaries are enclosed in their own boxes and being able to stand upright on the shelf, which will generally also help the preservation of their binding.
Interesting. All right, so now we have a question for Mara. What does amort sets mean on the set list?
Sorry, what does more sets mean on the set list?
They wrote it out. They saw it written on the set list at AMORT.
Yes. Okay, amort. It's amortized and amortized. So in television, if a set is in multiple episodes, usually, and again, I think if you ask anyone, everyone has a different barometer of what this means exactly, but usually if it's in 3 or more episodes, it's not just a recurring set. It doesn't come back just once, but it's kind of a foundational set for the show. That's an amort set. And so usually in budgeting for film and for television, I should say, there's an amortized budget, and there is a episodic budget. And so those kind of like core sets, that kind of run throughout, exist in kind of one thing, and then everything else becomes a one-off.
Another question from Mara. When you designed the buildings for the backlot, were they based on specific buildings from Storyville or original designs with architectural influences that were common at the time?
Because the main drag of Storyville was Basin Street, and that's the most documented. That was where the train line came in, and people kind of like the equivalent of Bourbon Street, where you'd see the girls in the windows, and it was the advertising for people to come off the train and get in. Because we didn't build Basin, we built the train line, and visual effects will be extending it. But the street that we built was Iberville, so it's perpendicular to Basin. Which was not as well documented. We didn't have as much kind of to go off of what exactly would have been there, but we did capture a few iconic places like Tom Anderson's saloon, the corner building, which is really famous in the Storyville photos. That's a building that we were pretty accurate on creating on the corner. And then there's 2 or 3 other buildings on the block that are pretty accurate recreations of actual buildings that were on Basin Street. And then the rest is kind of an amalgamation of period accurate architecture from the period.
Excellent. So possibly the same guest, they remain anonymous, asks another question from Mara. Is all the production documentation, set designs, costume designs, construction designs, research notes, etc., being archived? And if so, where?
Every show, it's a bit like the last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where all of the stuff gets boxed up, and literally both the physical elements of the show, but also the digital archives of all of this gets put on a website called Box. It gets boxed up, and it kind of disappears into the netherworld of whether or not a show is going to have a second season, whether it has to be reshot. But that's the only reason those archives or resources are held. And so we do all of this crazy work, and then it just kind of disappears. I keep all of it because I find there's a lot of overlap that can happen with when you're working in similar periods. But no, there's no source for this. Occasionally with the publicity world of film and television, some of that stuff will be made public, but there's so much of it. I mean, I think our department rap drive was multiple terabytes of data. So it's so much to go through.
Yeah, I can imagine. So another question for Nix. One of our viewers attendees is curious. Mara had talked about what brought her to New Orleans, and so they're wondering what brought you to New Orleans, Nix?
Well, I'm born and raised in New Orleans. I went to school in Boston, and then I came back. Having been in Boston for 4 years, I think the culture there is completely different from the culture of New Orleans, and I really missed and longed for that sense of connectivity and community that exists in New Orleans in a way that I think doesn't exist in other places, in that we just have a resilience and a sensitivity to the struggles of multiple people, regardless of who they are. So that's what always draws me to New Orleans.
Excellent. So another question for Nix. I am an MLIS student and interested in archives. Is there anything I can do or study to help work on Rice's materials in terms of preservation?
In terms of actually working on the collection is now available to the public, so there's no further work really to do on the collection besides wrapping up a few custom housing sort of aspects of the collection.
Yeah, makes sense. And that's fantastic that it's now open to the public and available. Someone else asks, and again for Nix, will the physical archives ever be digitized and made available online?
I cannot answer that question. It's highly dependent on many different factors, one of which is that digitization just takes a lot of time and labor and general curation to actually create digital surrogates of the collection in a way that people would understand like the physical collection as well. So I think that there's a possibility. I imagine that there's a slim chance that the entire collection is going to be digitized. But I imagine we'll do exhibits and also, provide digital assets. So
Fantastic.
kind of up in the air, but probable.
Yeah. So another question from Mara. Considering how important the source material is to you, do you often have disagreements about the level of detail you say is needed?
That's a tough one. I think, I've worked on several shows that are, so connected to the history that's being presented that there has to be a level of authenticity and rigor that takes a backseat to the story and the characters. For example, I worked on a show called Mrs. America that was about the women's movement in the 70s. And so like, I think for a show like that, you really just want to present as much of the realism of the time and everything that was happening and the detail. Like for me, you could never have enough real detail injected into that. For a show like Interview, I think what's a gift as a designer is that it has this foundation in the writing of both the novel and the screenplay of really incredible detail and texture of the city, but it's also fantasy. This is a story about vampires. And so there's a little bit of flexibility there. And I think that the other thing to think about with this story is that it's a memory piece. Louis is telling this story. So there's also a little bit of like bias from the narrator of like what that period was and what you're living through and romanticizing some things and not others. And I think that combination of things for Interview is such a gift, because as someone who has a history in architecture, who has a history of being a fan of Anne Rice, I think that there's a certain level of rigor to detail that kind of is going to be inherent to whatever I bring to the table. But there's also, again, because this is a collaborative art form, there has to be a little bit of malleability and flexibility to be able to tell the story at hand. And this was a really fun project to have that combination.
Great. So that kind of leads actually into a question I had for you, Mara, which was how did you coordinate and prioritize in your decision-making process between historical accuracy and fictional accuracy? If those two things were ever coming into conflict, did you have some kind of guiding principle that would help you decide which you would be more faithful?
Sometimes it's driven by budget and time, and sometimes things are driven by, again, because of the medium of filmmaking, with how a shot has to be constructed. It's like as an example, the interior of Lestat's townhouse or Gallier house, the kind of subtle changes that we made, like we had to make it a little bit bigger and added doors in places where they didn't necessarily exist because we needed people to come and go from different things. So there's a little bit of using the script as Bible to kind of like gestate and gel what the built world is going to be. And I think you could probably ask any producer, director, or writer on the show. I tend to be, I'm not a wilting wallflower when it comes to my opinions about what's important or not. And I think, if there's something that I thought was a really incredible detail of time or place or of relevance to Anne's writing, I would fight for it as much as it was possible to do that. But it is always kind of a dance and a balance to figure out how to do those things. And I think I always go back to what would I as a viewer want? And the shows that I like the most are the ones where the world feels all encompassing. You don't question it. And sometimes it makes you want to learn more about that time or place because you've seen or discovered something that you didn't necessarily know. And so I think a lot of the times, because I do so much research, I will often kind of suggest things that could be happening in the background, just to kind of liven things up and situate ourselves a bit more in time and place.
Yeah, absolutely. So another question, Nix, what was your favorite part of the collection, or what did you most enjoy working with as you processed it?
The fan mail, hands down. There's just so many interesting pieces of fan mail that really speak to Anne's impact on her audience and also her audience's impact on her. And in her diaries is also like writing down fan comments that she thinks are relevant to her work. And I remember one journal entry where she is livid about the fact that one of her fans has figured out the ending to her novel and how she's going to get out of that ending now that it's been revealed. So I love that there's this interplay between her fans and herself. And it's very fascinating to see the gamut of, historical researchers, scholars, people who are very clearly invested in the history of literature, I would say, versus people who are just very obsessed with vampires and want to know why and how and got into this avenue. And I'm just generally fascinated by that. And then also people who want to be a part of her universe. So people who want to be cast in the Interview with the Vampire movie, people who want to work for her, people who want to engage with her fan club, people who want donations from her. There's just all these people who are really, really invested in who she is. And I think the fan mail is one clear avenue where you see pretty much every aspect of how Anne Rice has touched American culture and like specifically like the Southern Gothic tradition and New Orleans culture.
Amazing. I also have a question for you, Nix. So as someone who is so clearly very engaged with history and archival research in her work, do you think that this passion and this mode of working influenced the sheer volume of documents that she left behind, that Anne Rice left behind? Do you think she was trying, in a sense, to archive herself on some level?
Well, I think Anne is clearly in collaboration with archivists, museum professionals, and librarians to find resources. So she's constantly sending letters to different institutions, just generally trying to get a sense of what they have and what she can use to build her world itself. What I find really fascinating is that both Brown and LSU reached out to her and basically was like, hey, we would love to talk to you about possibly acquiring your manuscript collection. And at the time that these letters are being sent to her, Anne does not have any real concept of what an archive is or what an archival collection entails in terms of what she can give. But she has these conversations with archivists specifically about archival work. And I would say that that would definitely inform Anne moving forward in having a very meticulously organized, a very meticulously labeled, and just like a very meticulously put together collection where a lot of the choices that she made were very clear to me off bat, which is not the case with pretty much any archival collection that I've processed. So I think Anne was really a breath of fresh air in that she clearly had a goal and intention for her collection.
Wonderful. So I think we've got time for 2 questions now. So first, one more for Nix. or have you become aware through the archive of any time that Anne might have clashed with the brackets, ridiculous, close brackets, stigma against women writing Gothic lit? The person asking the question points out that even though it was invented by a woman. Wondering if you could comment on this.
I personally have not seen it, but I will say that again, because archival processing is at a top level, I haven't read every single item that exists in the collection. So it's entirely possible that she's talked about these things. I just personally haven't seen it. I will say that Anne in her diaries is very specifically talking about gender and the impact that gender has had on her personal sense of self and her personal career. And a lot of that is that she feels in some ways encased by the sense of womanhood that has been impressed upon her. And as someone who becomes the breadwinner of her family and becomes, you know, this icon of literature, she's constantly running up against clear gender roles that just do not make sense for her and the tone of her life. So I think what's really interesting in her diaries is getting a sense of how her career and her interpersonal life sort of connect. And I imagine that there's probably more related to that question there.
Absolutely. So fascinating. So the last question is maybe an obvious one. Several people are wondering, Mara, when will the show air?
There is not a set release date, but it should be coming out this fall. So look forward to this when it's not so hot out.
Excellent. Well, let's now give another round of virtual applause to Nix Mendy and Mara LePere-Schloop. So on behalf of the Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses, I would like to thank Nix and Mara for speaking with us this evening. For more information on upcoming lectures in the Gallier Gathering series, please visit www.hggh.org or check us out on Facebook or Instagram for more information. And I would like to once again thank you for your continued support of our museum, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Gallier Gathering. Bye, everyone.